Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 19th chapter of Leviticus, and we're going to do something a little different today. Whereas in the past, I've read and analyzed the verses in a narrative sequence as they appear in the chapter, the general practice I want to encourage is to always look for repetition in the Bible or any work of literature, and especially more so this book, because by its dictates and precepts, individuals are saved or damned and nations rise and fall. So we really have to treat this book as more than a mere work of literature. But what I noticed doing this chapter is that in some form or another, all the 10 Commandments are expressed in this chapter. So I'm going to approach the order, not in the narrative sequence, but according to the commandments as they are arranged in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Now, as they appear, the first one is monotheism, second one is against idolatry, third one is honor the sacred name, fourth one is keep the Sabbath, fifth one is have respect for your parents, sixth one is do not murder, seventh and eighth are lie and bear false witness and steal. I honestly forget. And 10 is covet not thy neighbor's good. And we have to understand the different context in which they appear in order to appreciate that difference. Now, Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy all fall into the general genre of the Pentateuch, which is alternately known as the Torah. In Greek is Pentateuch. It's from the word five, so the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But they're in the Jewish language, they were referred to as the Torah, or the Law of Moses. Now, the 10 Commandments, as expressed first in Exodus 20 and then reiterated in basically repeated verbatim in Deuteronomy 5, are foundational to the entire genre. So we repeatedly see these principles and precepts expressed in certain contexts, but the book of Leviticus is distinct in that there's very, very little scarce narrative. A significant fraction of the Old Testament is arranged in a narrative, whereas Leviticus is more, it's oriented towards the priestly caste who hailed from the tribe of Levi, because that's where Moses and Aaron came from. So they set the they were to set the standard and the example for the entire community, and as far as mirroring, in as much as they mirrored Yahweh, they were too. So that's significant. But they had an important role to play, and an entire book was really dedicated to the ceremonial law, the moral law, and the civil law. But as I remember the 10 Commandments, the first one is monotheism, and this rendered Israel distinct from all of its neighbors and every other civilization in the ancient world, whereas the premise of polytheism was that each god had respective territories or terrains or elements in which they governed supremely over, but there is no concept of a single universal creator who was sovereign and the conceivable embodiment of moral perfection. Now, unlike the rival deities, one, Yahweh exists, and two, he wasn't bloodthirsty, promiscuous, or tempestuous. So that's just some foundation, and the first 2 verses incidentally pertain to that. And it reads, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, be sacred, for I, Yahweh, your Elohim, am sacred. So sacredness is an essential attribute of divinity, and sacred sets the standard. Now, the first 4 commandments are sacred, and that's to govern man's relation to Yahweh, whereas the final 6 commandments are righteous commandments. They're how we're to interact with humans, and the order is significant because sacredness is the foundation from righteousness, because like I said, he's the embodiment of conceivable moral perfection and therefore a flawless example. So if they worshipped him properly and listened to him, they would have all the guidance they need to give a powerful witness to them, because that was the purpose for which Israel was made. And also verse 32 just says, fear your Elohim, that can translate as worship or love. It's really, the fear, I think, is off-putting to a lot of people who don't understand, who take it at face value, and there's such a thing as a faithful fear. Now, generally, faith and fear cannot simultaneously coexist in this same vessel, but a proper fear of Yahweh is the fear which expels all other fears. And the second commandment is do not make idols. And that was the function through which these other deities were worshipped. They were non-existent. They had no metaphysical substance save the figments of imaginations, and they were more often than not a reflection of the black perverted heart of the Creator. They were human, all too human, just on a bigger stage and with more consequences. And the fourth verse reads, "Do not turn to idols, and do not make yourself molded mighty ones. I am Yahweh your Elohim." So the reason he didn't want them making idols is because it distracted and compromised the fullness of attention for which they were to pay to him. He was to be exclusive, and the tragedy of the Old Testament is many of their kings and many of their people succumbed to the pagan practices of the adjacent neighboring civilizations. And also verse 26 reads, "Do not practice divination or magic." These are two forms of occult practices that were prolific in the region they were to settle in, and these are forbidden. They're the same, not quite the same thing as idolatry, but in the same general category. And verse 31 reads, "Do not turn to mediums, and do not seek after spiritists to be defiled by them. I am Yahweh your Elohim." So we notice in both that he concludes the injunction with a reminder of who he is. And having heard that, the magician and spiritist don't be defiled by them, because they will defile you. They may make an accurate prediction once, but it's not a reliable source of information you can live on. So you're ultimately defiled by seeking these defiled practice. And the third commandment is to honor the sacred name of Yahweh, and verse 12 reads, "And do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your Elohim. I am Yahweh." So one of the challenges they had to contend with of belonging to Yahweh is using his name in vain, because we profane, we mix it with profanity when we say GD, I'm not going to say it, but really, in swearing falsely. So a lot of, when you swear on something, it's to secure someone's trust for a transaction or something of that nature. But if you swear on Yahweh, you better be careful, because you're dealing with forces beyond your power to manipulate or control. And he just wants you to know that. And the fourth commandment is the Sabbath. Honor the Sabbath. So on the seventh day, Israel, where they worked 7 days a week as slaves in Egypt, he wanted a special day designated where commerce ceased, manual labor ceased, and it was to be devoted to worship and fellowship. And the third verse reads, "Guard my Sabbath, I am Yahweh your Elohim." So again, a similar ending, reminding them who he is, and it's my Sabbath, my day, not your day. So Sunday there's no I in Son, but there is in you, and the you is up there. And verse 30, verse 30 says, "Keep my Sabbath and fear my temple. I am Yahweh." Now the temple had not been in construction yet, so it was really the tabernacle. That's just this translation, so it may appear as tabernacle. That was the center of the divine presence where he dwelled, and they were to congregate around there for their significant holidays, and people who lived in Jerusalem became the capital of by the time David reigned. And then the fifth commandment is honor the father and mother. And verse 3 reads, "And each one of you should fear his mother and his father, and guard." And we already read verse 3b, which was a sabbatical injunction. So the word fear again appears, and we have to understand it as we did with Yahweh. We shouldn't obey our heavenly Father or earthly Father out of fear, but as an act of love and an expression thereof. And verse 32, remember the second half corresponds with the first commandment. The first half reads, "Rise up before you're gray-headed, and you shall favor the face of an old man. So this is respect for elders, which is an extension of the principle of son and daughterly obedience, to respect the elders because they came before you, they're wiser, and they sacrificed more. And the sixth commandment is thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not murder, and it's significant because it's not thou shalt not kill. So they were commanded, for example, to eliminate essentially genocide by modern standards, entire communities of the Aboriginal inhabitants. So that was divinely sanctioned. And of course, there were penalties for disobedience, which were the capital law, which was stoning. So there's ultimately, so killing animals is not the same thing as murdering them when it's done sacrificially and in the right spirit. It's not the act itself, but the faith which executes the act, which really counts. And there's just some outlines because the animal sacrifice was central to their typological portent of the Messiah to come. And verse 22 reads, and the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before Yahweh for his sin which he has done, and the sin which he has sinned shall be forgiven him. So that explains how there's such a thing as a righteous killing. It's not quite, it falls into the umbrella category of the sixth commandment. But basically the word atonement is significant. This was unique to the Hebrew people in that they could have their sins be forgiven, whereas the other nations worshipped out of fear and appeased their deities, essentially. And the seventh commandment is adultery, but it more extensively, it falls in the umbrella of sexual sin. And there's a few here. And when a man has, 20th verse, and when a man has intercourse with a woman who is a female servant, engaged to a man, and who has not at all been ransomed nor redeemed, nor freedom given, there should be an inquiry, but they are not put to death, because she was not free. So masters essentially had control over their slaves. So he understood that certain women in this position would be vulnerable to the sexual advances of their masters, and it wasn't a crime punishable by death. And you can type in Corey Johnston, 1 Timothy 6 for more on the Bible and slavery. We ultimately don't have enough time. But the other verse which pertains to sexual sin is the 29th, and it reads, do not profane your daughter by making her a whore, so that the land does not whore, and the land becomes filled with wickedness. So it's really a ripple effect. As one individual goes, that taints the entire society, and the land becomes filled with wickedness, and the land follows, because once one person does it, it's acceptable. And it's should be, at least in this community, not something worth putting. They should know better, having the outlines. And the eighth and ninth commandment is murder, and then bear false witness, and they combine in the 11th verse, which reads, do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive another. Basically self-explanatory from a utilitarian and moral standpoint. The entire societal order is tossed into disequilibrium when people are dishonest and take things that don't belong to them. And the 10th commandment is covetousness. Now this is distinct from its predecessor commandments in that it's an attitude, not an action, but it is from that attitude where virtually all other transgressions stem. So it was really a cornerstone commandment. And the verses which correspond to the 10th commandment are 16 and 17. Do not go slandering among your people. Do not stand against the blood of your neighbor. I am Yahweh. Do not, and the 10th commandment reads, do not covet your neighbor's agricultural equipment. And so neighbor's significant. So it was more than coveting, but more positively an act of neighborly love. And this ultimately set the Israelites distinct. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Reprove your neighbor for certain, and bear no sin because of him. Do not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the children of your people, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. Now, when the master was, I earlier mentioned there are 613 commands, and one of the topics of discussion amongst the Pharisees and the scholarly community in the intertestamental period all the way up to Yahshua's ministry was, what is the greatest commandment? And when Yahshua answered, he quoted Deuteronomy 6:5, love Yahweh with all your faculties and all their capacities, and love your neighbor, and that sums up the entire law. So 613 are satisfied by those two. And also corresponding to the 10th verse reads, and when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, do not oppress him. Let the stranger who dwells among you be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your Elohim. So he's appealing to their memory. They knew what it was like to be in a different nation as a foreigner, and they should be empathetic to the foreigners in their midst. Now, sadly, Israel possessed these principles but didn't always practice them. But the fact that they had these standards made them essentially better off than any other people in the ancient world. And we're just going to close with verse 37, and you shall keep all my laws and all my justices and do them. I am Yahweh. So if you break one commandment, you're essentially guilty of all, James 2:10. And it's really a chain reaction. One sin leads to another, and it has a telephone ripple effect in the community. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.